Hi, welcome to episode 26 of the American Tributaries podcast, where to break out of the bubbles we've all been living in these last few years, we are using modern technology to explore the various currents of people in our great country, kind of like a 21st century Lewis and Clark journey. I'm your host, Michael Whidden, and thank you for joining me in this exploration of America. If you enjoy listening, please subscribe on whatever platform you're using, give us a like on this particular episode, and check us out on Instagram at American Tributaries Podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Martin Johnson. Martin and I have been good friends for more than 10 years. And, well, usually at this point in the podcast, I would give a background to my guest. But I thought what I would do today is to let our guest himself tell us his background. So, Martin, thanks so much for joining me today. How are you doing? And what's your story?
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm doing reasonably well, as I often say. And my story, the abbreviated version of my story. I am a freelance journalist and a cheesemonger, and sometimes a craft beer expert. And my freelance journalism career began in 1984. I have written for a wide variety of leading publications and websites. Vogue, Rolling Stone, the New York Times, Washington Post. I presently am the senior jazz critic at the Wall Street Journal. I also write for NPR Music. I report for NPR News. I also write for Tidal, Bandcamp, Jazz Times, and Chamber Music America's magazine. In addition to that, back in 1984, again, pivotal moment that summer of 84, I began working in the New York fancy food business and have become well known as a cheesemonger. I have worked in a variety of places. I sort of cite Bedford Cheese Shop you know, as my alma mater in many ways. I worked there from 2004 to 2011, when at the late lamented Brooklyn location, and really watched it and helped it grow from a um, a little room in the back of a mini mall to an international force in the world of artisan cheese, and just proud of that. Right now, I manage a small shop near Lincoln Center called 67 Gourmet. We launched in January, and well, we're still approaching our cruising altitude, but we're very proud of the cheese selection we have, the olive oil selection we have, the vinegars that we have, and we're hoping to add. Well, I, we have already added a good bit of cured meats from the all over the country, places like Lakersha in Iowa and Smoking Goose in Indianapolis. And we're hoping to broaden that selection to through many other items to really, transition. We were conceived as the cheese shop wing of 67 Wine and Spirits, and my aim is to make our shop the Columbus Avenue hub of deliciousness.
that's awesome. and more, as I was thinking about the talking with you today, the thing that I found daunting is I realized there are so many different subject matters in which you could probably do like a multi-part series of a podcast, whether it's the music or beer or cheese or sports or so many other things. So but the big thing I find is, I guess, I guess your writing is something that's been a constant thread for you since you got here. What I was wondering though is, you move to you moved to New York in 84, or is that when you graduated from college?
I moved to New York in '78 to attend college.
Okay.
Um, I had I had put it's a funny story. I had put um, in my sort of teenage, sitting in my room listening to records, planning my young adult years. I had thought that the ideal thing would be to go to college at somewhere where I had legacy, like University of Chicago or Northwestern, and then go to New York and go to grad journalism school at Columbia. Um, I was writing this. I went to a magnet school. I lived in. I'm from Chicago. I think Midwesterners can hear the Chicago in my accent still. The
How do you say
the
roof?
hmm,
How do you say roof?
root
Yeah, roof.
roof.
Okay. Is it a Wisconsin thing when they say rough?
It must be because I ain't a Chicago thing.
Okay. All right, go on. Sorry, I didn't mean
Uh,
to interrupt.
the But at any rate, yeah, I'd grown up in Chicago. My dad's business moved to Dallas, Texas, in 1974 when I was 14. I told my folks, "Don't worry, I can stay here in Chicago. I can take care of myself." And they were like, "Yeah, pack." and Dallas was an adventure, and the kindest thing I can say is that it motivated me to do really well in school so that I could travel for college. And I met some people who were similarly academically ambitious, and one of the first friends that I made when I moved to Dallas, and I just happened to be riding the school bus back from our magnet school all the way across town. And we were comparing notes about college ambitions. And he asked me, "Where in New York did you apply?" And I was like, "Well, and he was like, "You didn't apply to school to go to college in New York?" And I was like, "Well, and he was like, "Look, you're more New York than anybody I know." And I was like, "Well, thank you." And he went on to explain, I read the Village Voice, I watch Kojak reruns, etc. And then all that was a lead up to telling me that he had an application to Columbia that he wasn't using. He was the oldest in his family. His dad was not doing well. He felt a need to stay close, so he had early applied to Rice and gotten in. Why don't I take his application to Columbia? Here's a pen. Take it now and fill it out. Filled it out. Didn't really think anything of it. I got into University of Chicago, got into Northwestern. Family warfare broke out between my dad and my sister, both of whom have MBAs from there. Like, I was not an MBA candidate, but still. University of Chicago, Northwestern. It's like the Cubs and the White Sox. You just can't stop the fans from fighting, even if the teams aren't very good. Um, and out of the blue, I get this envelope from Columbia University Black Students Organization inviting me to New Students Weekend. Really? Y'all trying to tell me something? 3 days later, I get the big, thick envelope welcoming me to the class of 1982. Uh, so I get there, and I'm figuring I'm in New York City. Woo! I get to my first class. It's called Contemporary Civilization. It's part of the famed core curriculum. And they hand me this big, thick book. Well, they don't hand it to me. They tell me go buy it from the bookstore. This big, thick book called The Republic. I'm like, oh, really? And they were like, yeah, we're going to discuss the first 200 pages of it on Thursday. This is Tuesday. Thursday? Oh, okay. So I realized that this business of woohoo, we're in New York City might have to wait for 4 years, and it more or less did. And by that time, I had visited the journalism school and was told if you wanted to be a journalist, you didn't have to come to journalism school. You should just go be a journalist. So I I started. I tried. Didn't get anywhere in '82. Worked a BS job until I realized that I was spinning my wheels in terms of my professional ambitions. And that was spring of '84. So I quit. And I sort of quit and took unemployment. And it was a job where I'd worked many more hours than is healthy for a person. So I'd actually built up kind of an escrow of hours that would, because I was working 100 hours a week or so. So I spent the summer, first of all, woohoo, we're in New York City. Two, I walked into the offices of the Amsterdam News in Harlem and asked to see the arts editor. It was pointed toward a gentle elderly man's office, and he was Mel Tapley. And I was like, "Mr. Tapley, I'm a recent graduate from Columbia University. I want to write about jazz. There's a jazz festival coming up. May I write about it? May I write a story, previewing it?" And he was like, "Sure, young man. I'll take 400 words. Bring it to me by Monday." And so I did. I brought it to him on Monday. I picked up the paper on Thursday. There it was. I called him, thanked him, and he was like, What would you like to write about now? And away we went.
Wow.
So my work at the Amsterdam News was seen by people at a rival feistier Brooklyn paper called the City Sun. They recruited me. My work at the City Sun was seen by people at the Village Voice and at Newsday, and I wound up doing a lot of stuff for Newsday for many, many, many years. The Newsday stuff opened the doors to Rolling Stone and Essence, and the Rolling Stone stuff opened the doors to Vogue, and so on and so forth.
Wow. Now, was all of that, was that a full time job, or were you doing other work on the side while you were doing
It was
that?
all freelance.
Mhm.
My relationship to HR departments at in major journalism outlets is not pretty. I interviewed at the Times right after college and was told that I wasn't cut out for journalism. They needed somebody that could work hard. Um,
Wow.
it was the first time I was given notice that some people thought that Columbia University was a party school. Um, Given that I was still shaken from my memories of being 18 and being told that I was responsible for 300 pages of a wonderful but very complex book within 48 hours. I to this day I marvel over the fact that I didn't stand up in this woman's office and start screaming at her. Um, I was told the same thing at the Cleveland Plain Dealer after winning winning 8 rounds of interviews quite swimmingly. An assistant arts editor told me, "Yo, you wouldn't have liked it here, wouldn't have." No, we're really looking for somebody that can work hard. Um, that was my 20s. In my 30s, I applied for many more staff jobs. Started to hear a different excuse. We're not looking for a diversity hire right now. I'm like, that's fine. You're looking for somebody with 3 to 4 years experience. I have 7. Um, you can diversify elsewhere,
Right, right.
And they're like, no, you know what it mean. What we mean, ha ha ha. And I'm like, no, I'm working in the food business and doing journalism and working 6.5, sometimes 7 days a week. I don't think it's funny. I would like to have, a 401k benefits, but and then of course by the time I was in my 40s, it was like, they wouldn't. I'm younger than you are, and they wouldn't even consider me for this job. So hey, you know. And then finally, during the pandemic in 2020, I got interviewed and won the interview round for a job, an editor job at a prominent publishing weekly. And it was going to be a lot of work. I could see right off the bat it was going to be a 55 hour work week, but hey, it's a full-time job. I'm into it. And they made me a salary offer of $50,000 a year. And I'm like, I kind of
That's
make that freelancing and working in the food business, you know? So no, I the one staff job I had was even that wasn't a real staff job. It was sort of but it was I had the editor title and whatnot. Was for a website that existed for about a year and a half during the dot-com boom, and it was straight out of your favorite hip comedy. I mean, it was a dot-com with a CEO, a president and CEO that didn't know how to use email in the year 2000. So you can imagine, none of us thought, oh, this is going to be here long term. No.
yeah. Wow.
But sure enough, early 2001, vulture capitalists had gotten it and drained all the seed money and, told us let's just say, told us goodbye.
Yeah. Oof. So in your so then you've seen basically like almost 40 years of the media landscape changing.
Oh, absolutely.
Um, has it? I mean, do you like? Has the I guess the onset of like digital media and everything is your overall assessment that it's been better or worse for the for the for journalism?
That's a good question. I would say it's a little of both. Um, it's certainly it in the in the early going, it created more outlets, and that was awesome. However, as the shakeout began to happen, both with the .com crash of 2000, the early 2000s, and with the market crash in 2008 and whatnot, the recession there, um, it began to shrink the number of outlets and and because of the way that there was sort of public relations synergy within a lot of the web things because eyeballs count. Um, it tended to begin to, I would say, shrink maybe the level of integrity involved, and certainly make it harder in a lot of ways what I to do my job. I mean, plain and simple. I okay, when the Color Purple reopened on Broadway about 5 years ago, I was there covering it for the Root, and you would think it's a it's a pretty big deal, and we should be a primary outlet for this sort of thing. I was literally timed, given 3 minutes to talk to each of the stars. Um, Jennifer Hudson, it turns out, is from, and I knew this in my background, is also from the South Side of Chicago. So I mentioned that right off the bat to her, and to her, to my to my everlasting admiration. When the PR people literally came and took me by the shoulders to say, "Okay, we must move on," she grabbed one of them and said, "No, this is the South Side of Chicago talking. We will talk till we finish."
That's
That's
great.
such a massive contrast to when I did a piece that sadly didn't run for Rolling Stone on Guru of Gangstar and the beginning of his Jazz Mataz project, his hip hop jazz merger in the early '90s. I went to lunch with him. Then the PR guy basically paid the bill and was heading back to the office. And Guru just like says, "Hey, let's go get a coffee at the Starbucks up here and keep talking." And I hung out with him then. And then he actually said, because he was a little older than a lot of he was closer to my age than he was LL Cool J's age. And so he literally, suggested that the record company bring me overseas to film the videos and whatnot. And but he and I had talked officially for an hour and a half, talked over coffee for an hour, and he didn't mind any of that being on the. He was perfectly happy with letting that be on the record, and then he's inviting me to go on a trip with him. So yeah, contrast that to 3 minutes. 3 minutes with PR people, and even a phone interview. I would do like I would get 10 minutes with somebody, and I don't remember the exact details, but it was I was interviewing somebody who had been in somebody who was part of a brand new TV series. That was the detail, and it was literally this week. It was it was the week after week one of the NFL, and this guy was renowned. This guy was a former. He'd been a college football player, and played maybe briefly in the pros. It was not Nandi Ashimoto. It was somebody else, but still. And in he wanted to, so my warm up question was, so what's your take from week one? And he talked for a few minutes, and then we start talking about the TV series. And out of the blue, he starts, the PR person, okay, we have to stop now. Just like, and he was candid. He was like, no, I don't have anybody else on my appointment. Why can't we keep talking? So it really did control the message, or it allowed corporate control of the message in a lot of ways was not healthy for good journalism. And I'm not unique in these complaints. Jeff Gordonier of the Times became a food writer because he was writing about music and film for details and whatnot around the turn of the century, and he saw that what used to be spend a day with an actor turned into spend 20 minutes with them. And how are you supposed to pound out a story like that? So he started writing about chefs, and even then, he started to see the access limit again being limited, and so he left the field.
Mhm. Wow. Yeah, no, it is it do you think is it controlling the message, or is it more maybe there's just so many more outlets than there were before that all these PR people think that, they're I guess they're trying to maximize their exposure, and then by doing that they're really kind of providing a very thin, like, I guess, journalistic
It's a little
product.
both. It's a little both. I mean, you control you control the access, and there's less opportunity for a comfort level to develop and for really interesting things to be said. Um, in 2003, I completely lucked into an ideal scenario at Newsday. First of all, the music editor became the arts editor. Secondly, one of the film writers went on, it's not hiatus, sabbatical that summer. And so I was already the lead freelancer when it came to music. And I decided, let me see if I can make the case to be one of the freelancers on film. So it's an easy, the obvious approach. Let's get the film people who have music backgrounds, because that's a clear and easy assignment. So I did a piece on Mark Wahlberg, who was pretty awesome. I did a piece on Mandy Moore, who was, well, sweet. Um, and then out of the blue, a couple of days after the Moore piece runs, I get a breathless call from my editor asking me if I can interview Angelina Jolie that Sunday. Yeah, I'll figure out a way. Um, so I won. And it's funny too because it was pegged to a not very interesting movie. It was the Lara Croft thing. Um, so I went to a screener, and then a Sunday afternoon, my photographer had 10 minutes, and then I went and sat down and had half an hour with her, and you know, she, as you might well imagine, for Angelina Jolie circa 2003, had a pretty stern critique of American media versus British media, and because she at that point, pretty much ignored the American media and read the Guardian and BBC Four and whatever, three or whatever, but still, she was, she was thoughtful, and when you'd have 10 minutes, you never get to that part of the conversation. So it's controlling it in that way. It keeps it strictly on point. I mean, Susan Orlean, the great New Yorker feature writer and one of my all-time idols, talked at one of her book release readings about how she had to get away from that because she was discovering that everybody had canned lines and canned lines that they would deliver with the same inflection and whatnot, and because they were actors,
Yeah. Yeah.
this was fine, Um, so yeah, it homogenizes the message
Yeah.
by limiting access, homogenizes the message, and so that was that was sad. And the saving grace for me in terms of my career was that I was writing for the Wall Street Journal, the and so and you would think, okay, Wall Street Journal, you can demand stuff. Not necessarily. Julie Delpy is French, and I was supposed to interview her, and I said I was working at Gastronomy 491 at the time, and I was like, have her come to the cafe. I will make her a cheese plate. And the PR people completely nixed it and whatnot. But around the time shortly after that happened, the journal switched its focal point on arts coverage from being feature stories to being reviews. And my editor was like, "I really, you don't really write reviews; you write criticism. And that's what I want."
Mm. It's interesting because what it sounds like is that in some respect, like the reporting part of like what you're doing, as that becomes closed off to being just kind of really just being like a channel, a communication channel for that end product that that person you're talking to or that movie you're talking about. It's better to just go on your own and become a critic, because at least then you can kind of, you're not as circumscribed as to what you're
I'm
writing
not.
about.
I'm not as circumscribed, but also my goal is different. I just finished a piece for the Wall Street Journal on two up and coming piano players, Angelica Sanchez and Jonas Crete. And the function wasn't to say these are the up and coming piano players, but rather to say what makes these two players interesting and unique right now is what is making a lot of new players in the 2020s interesting and unique. The style that you might judge that, for one, we're in a scenario for the last half century where jazz isn't really defined by convenient and easy buzzwords. Swing, bebop, free, avant-garde, cool, whatever. All these labels still exist, but none of them really apply very much to, a record that was produced in 2021 or 2022. But the decades, if you go through the decades have their independent sounds and distinctive sounds. And Escrit and Sanchez are creating music that have a sound that feels very distinctive of the 2020s. And my thinking when I write for the journal is that I'm writing for somebody who's not an obsessive, but someone who's knowledgeable. I was at an advanced screening for Ken Burns Jazz and his multi-volume documentary back in 1999, 2000, somewhere thereabouts, and literally taking a leak after the screening of one of the episodes. There was a guy in a suit next to me at the stall, and he asked me what I thought, and I told him a few things, and he was like, and he smiled. You may not think of me as a great jazz fan, but I was, I was aspiring to become a jazz pianist, and spent a couple of years out of after college playing on the scene. Rattles off a few names of people he played with, and my eyes get really wide because this guy's played with some of the all-time legends. And he said, "But we had two kids. I felt like I had a responsibility, so I took a job at a bank, and I'm proud that my bank can support these things." I was like, "Okay, that's cool," and mm, and and then he expressed his own disappointment with Burns that Burns' timeline stopped in 1970, and he started rattling off people that he liked that had emerged since then that he felt should have been part of the documentary that weren't. And so I've always thought that guy is my reader, and I want he may not know who Angelica Sanchez is, but if the Wall Street Journal tells him that Angelica Sanchez is really a really interesting player, and good God, is she ever, he will A, investigate, and B, he will have a solid grasp of what to look for, what to
Mm,
listen for,
interesting.
so on and
Uh,
so forth. So, yeah, criticism criticism forces you to think more deeply.
mm,
I mean, honestly, I still write feature stories, and the ones I particularly like are the ones I've done for Title, are the ones where I actually do have a little bit of history with the subject. I wrote one on Robert Glasper this past winter when Black Radio was coming out, and it was fun. I had interviewed Glasper for New York Magazine 15 years earlier when he was just his career was just beginning to take flight. He was working, I think, on his second record for Blue Note Records, a prominent jazz label. And now here he is, he's in as much as one can be in the jazz and hip hop world, or at least the creative music overlap that he does. He's a superstar. Yeah, and it was fun writing the story, talking about Robert 1997 and Robert 2022, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah. I mean, it it's hard. I would not be happy trying to write a feature story off of 10-minute interview now.
Yeah. Yeah, it'd be pretty canned, and it'd be hard to be different.
Yeah, it would be very canned. I mean, it would be very canned, and I would probably look at some of the other stories written about this particular artist, and I'd see the same quotes.
Hmm.
So yeah.
I guess I've never. One of the things I've thought of is like, if somebody would ever, like, I don't know, like really, I don't know, like if you were to ever have like a journalist who was to report on Michael Whidden, and not that anybody would ever have any interest doing that, but there's like a whole lot of like warts and flaws and things that would not look favorable, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like when I think about like journalists, I think, I guess, while I think objectively, and I think like for the health of society, you want to have journalists who are like scrutinizing. Um, there's like, I guess there's two parts to what I'm thinking. Like with you, is that one, like there is also like, I guess, like and especially this day and age, there's like that push to try to get eyeballs, right? So
Mm-hmm.
reporting something good, there's less incentive than reporting something that's that's a problem. Like if I listen to sports radio, and there's a lot more talk about things when people are upset and angry and
Right. Of
criticizing.
course.
um and the other thing that I would say, just, and then I want to hear your thoughts, is like when you think about like criticism or critics, right? I think about like restaurants, and one of the things that I always kind of roll my eyes at is when I see a restaurant that gets its 3 stars from Michelin. All you get is like how much they love Michelin, or when they get a nice review in the New York Times. Thank you so much. We're so grateful. Our staff is so, like, it means so much to us. They do a picture and post on Instagram showing how the entire staff at the restaurant is so happy. But when they get the negative review, then all of a sudden, like, they're upset and they're angry. And it's like, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. So I'm not, I guess, to me, I'm just wondering like what your thoughts were, because I feel like if I was a restaurant, I would not necessarily be overly promoting how grateful I was for those kind of stars and those kind of reviews, because I know that there's another side to it. And I wouldn't want my staff thinking that the most happiest moment in, the year is going to be when we get our good review from the Times or from Michelin, versus just like having a good day. So just kind of wondering what you think about
Yeah, but the good
that world.
review keeps you in business.
Oh no, you could be happy. I'm not saying not to be happy, but to like make that, like, when you're setting basically the benchmark for being happy and successful with somebody else versus something
Oh,
you
for
can control.
sure. But when you're in business, um, external validation equals profits.
Mm-hmm.
And without profits, especially I think these days, I know that long time ago when I first got into the business, into the New York food business, everybody said that like 4 out of every 5 new businesses fail, and I've certainly worked for more than a few that have done that. But notoriety, one of the surest means of avoiding failure is notoriety, because I think, and maybe you can talk about this too, I feel like the pace of life is a lot faster now than it was 25 years ago, 30 years ago. And you have to distinguish yourself in a larger blur than you did when our rents were more reasonable or
Mm-hmm.
whatever.
Yeah, and in what way would, when you say you have to distinguish yourself? You mean as far as like just getting those reviews?
Yeah, I tend to think people have less free time than they used to, and more things competing for that time than they used to. So, if there's a story saying there's this interesting restaurant, there's this interesting culinary endeavor here, it's worth going out of your way for, then that broadens the range of potential customers for you.
Right. Yeah. But I guess then that goes to that helps, I guess, like perpetuate the environment where publicists are risk averse because they don't want you. They want to either have a good review or they don't want to have
Oh, of
anything.
course,
They want
of
plain
course.
vanilla. Then, right?
No, of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah. So, if you were asked, if you had a choice to write a book about any subject that you are a fan of, whether it's cheese or craft beer or music or sports or anything else, what would you write? What would you write that book on?
I'd write whatever book the publishing industry would buy. I've written 8 book proposals,
Is that
and I've
right?
been turned down on each of them. And writing
Ah,
book proposals is hard. They're generally 3, 4, 5, 6 month endeavors. I spent 10 months writing my first book proposal, and it was a music book on a great jazz trumpet player named Lee Morgan, who um, in high school had Art Blakey and Dizzy Gillespie trying to get him to come out on tour with them during his summer vacations, and yet before he was even 34 years old, he was shot to death outside a New York City jazz club by his common law wife. Pretty dramatic life, pretty dramatic, narrative there, right? Um, Got shopped to 15 different publishing houses, including the two that specialize in music, both of whom said they didn't like my writing. Um, I've spent 6 months on other book proposals. I, you know, I'm beginning to work on a family memoir, and because my mom's side of the family is stories of great savvy, heroism, courage. My mom used to tell stories about how when she was a little girl, her dad would wake her up in the middle of the night sometimes. Her name's Marjorie, and tell her, "Ree, get your gun," and she would run out to the porch in Longview, Texas, um, and whiz bullets by the ears of Klansmen and other people who, other crackers who'd come to let the animals out or burn the barn down or try to do stuff like that. She was a markswoman, so she even at a young age, and she was a shorty too, because so that she wouldn't be seen on the porch because you she was lower than the banister, and and she was such a good shooter that she wouldn't hit the attackers because that would get Grandpa lynched, probably get her lynched too. But she could whiz bullets by them, and then she would always tell the story that. And then there was this one time that accidentally she shot a horse, and she's like destroyed her.
wow.
So yeah, there are many other stories with my family. I mean, my dad used a contrived to use a I don't want to say phony address, but used a relative's address to get his VA benefits so that he get a GI Bill benefits so that he could attend, because in Illinois you had to attend the school that was closest to you. The relative lived near the University of Chicago, so that kind of thing. And thanks to that, and thanks to there are dozens of stories like that. So
Wow, the Johnson family lore.
yeah, or Harris family lore. Actually, it's my
There's
mom's
okay.
side.
That's something. Um, for cheese, one of the things, because for like the audience listening, Martin and I think really kind of like the foundations of our relationship was teaching cheese and wine classes at the 92nd Street Y for about 10 years. So we've spent a lot of time talking and working with cheese, and I always found that I think cheese and wine were both two areas where people felt like they should know a lot, but they didn't know a lot. There's a lot of great options, lots of different prices, lots of different, like it's kind of like it's a fun geeky thing to like dive into, but it's also a very daunting thing to kind of get into. So like one of the things I always found helpful is to like for us to I guess like talk about like the basics for people. So I guess for the benefit of like listeners, like what do you tell like if somebody goes to your cheese shop, and they're just kind of overwhelmed because they're used to just buying Swiss cheese or cheddar or like whatever. Like how do you break down like what kind of cheeses they should have, what quantities of cheeses they should have? Like, what's your advice?
Um, it's kind of on a case by case basis. I mean, the first thing you want to do is make the person feel comfortable in the space. Second thing you want to do is excite them about what's there. Oh, this cheese is one of the most decorated American artisan cheeses. It's one of those rare cheeses that pairs equally well with the acidity of a white wine as it does with the tannins of a red. Um, this cheese here, it's one of these cheeses my customer calls. This cheese here is a absolute bliss. It's a cheese one of my customers calls a religious experience. He walks in every 2 weeks and announces, Martin, I am going to church. It means that his sale starts with one of those. Um, I do sign. I typically do signage where I might compare a cheese to a De Niro performance in a certain movie, or a or a fame a famous a particular album by the Rolling Stones or something like that. Um, for the most part, a lot of it's just trying to. I use culture to break it down, but I also use conviviality to break it down because the idea is New Yorkers are not walking on New Yorkers, even the New Yorkers that are part of our clientele. They have an idea of what a Malbec is. They have an idea of what a Cabernet Sauvignon is. Even if all they can say is, "Oh, it's a medium-bodied red wine. It's a full-bodied red wine." Whatever. They have no clue for the most part what Harbison is, and so in the end, I think because there's more of a structure for apprehending wine or beer or spirits for that matter, um, blended Scotch, single malt Scotch. These paradigms are part of the lexicon, whereas Alpine cheese, soft ripened cheese, bark wrapped cheese, these things are not part of the lexicon. A lot of what we're just trying to do is build a trust, build a trust, and yeah, I know it's working at 67 Gourmet because I can't tell you how many times I've had somebody come in and say, "I love the cheeses I got last time. I don't know what they were." So and you have to say, okay, well, I could pick your brain for the next 20 minutes, or we can just take it from top. You want something soft or hard? One of each? Sure. Let's talk about the soft cheese.
Yeah, no, I find that like really, at least what I saw with my like 12 years of sales, is like knowledge is really is not really about using your knowledge to like taking it from your head and giving it to somebody else. It is that foundation of trust. And I find like when I know there are subjects that I don't know anything about, and when you talk to somebody, you really want like you're almost more interested in not like what do they know, but can they teach me in a way that makes me feel comfortable with
Mm-hmm.
them,
Oh,
and
absolutely.
kind of, and is it consistent? I mean, does it make sense? Like you don't have to know a lot about cheese, but somebody asks you a question and you already make them feel stupid, whether or not you actually know what you're talking about, you've
Right.
lost them as far as somebody
Of
who's going to
course.
trust you to buy something.
Oh,
So
of course.
you have to wield your knowledge like almost carefully, and not in a way that's
Mm-hmm.
meant to inform them, but more to build trust. And I think it's funny, like when you talk about like also excitement is like one of the criticisms that like at least I would have with like seeing my kids go through like the city schools and learn about like science, is like you rarely, I don't think there's anybody's ever come home saying like they were excited about science. And I
Mm-hmm.
think like to me that's one element that gets lost in like a lot of education, is just like before you start throwing all those facts at people and whatever, just cultivate excitement, because the excitement is going to be what makes them want to learn more. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's where it gets fun. But I guess the interesting is, as we're talking about it, is I realize like knowledge is the way you build trust. Then you've got to cultivate the excitement. And then once they're in, now you can totally geek out and go back to like the knowledge and the facts, because then it
Hmm.
becomes like a thrilling rabbit hole to start learning about all the different things that are being done.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, one of the most influential things that shaped what I've done over the last 8 9 years is an interview I read in 2014 with a famous sommelier who said who himself was celebrating his 20th anniversary of working in New York City, and the obvious question was, well, what's different about 2014 as opposed to 1994? And he said, well, in 1994 you had to build a wine list that catered to what people knew. So you had to have that Malbec, you had to have that Cabernet, you had to have that Chardonnay, that kind of thing. Whereas in 2014, you had to build a list that made people feel comfortable going outside their range of knowledge, so they'll try an Aglianico, or they'll try a Gavi de Gavi, or something like that.
Mm. Yeah, very true. Um, I think the popular, I guess, conception of cheese is that the French are the specialists in cheese, and like maybe the Italians just been doing it for a long time. But from my recollection and talking with you, that's definitely not the case. I guess in vis-a-vis like domestic cheese. So I was wondering if you could kind of like talk a little bit about like the scene with in the United States and all the cheese that's out there.
The French make good cheese. I'm
Hmm.
not going to deny that.
Oh yeah, no, not that they
The
don't, but
Italians
that
make good
U.S.
cheese too.
cheese,
I'm not going
right?
to deny that.
Uh,
I mean, there's a lot of great cheese being made in the United States, and the thing that it has a plus and a minus. The plus is that it doesn't have to cross an ocean to get to your local fromagerie. The minus is that dairy farm has probably been around for 10 years, 12, you know, 20 tops. If it's older than that, then it's a true OG like Point Reyes or Cowgirl Creamery or something like that. But at any rate, um, and as such, the two things. One, they're paying off a higher degree of the banknote. That farm in France, they paid off their banknote sometime in the 19th century. You know, that farm in America, they still have a bunch of debt that they're writing. Two, that farm in France, because they paid off their banknote in the 19th century, they're a little better insulated toward the chaos of economic cataclysms, pandemics, things like that. Whereas the American farms, not as much. One of my the producers of my absolute favorite ricotta just went out of business. Um, so the price differential for the American cheeses is going to be higher. And it's hard sometimes when you get people who are in the habit of thinking that a great cheese costs X number of euros, and then they see it in the United States and it's 2X, number of dollars or whatever. But yeah, there's a lot of great cheese being made here, because I think in general, it's a realer it's a realer way of making a business than being a marketing consultant. When you're a marketing consultant, you're essentially tweaking numbers. When you're a dairy farmer, you're making something that feeds people.
yeah.
So there's this kind of inexorable lean toward the movement toward American artists and producers, and then there's an opportunity. If you're making cheese in Savoie, you're making cheese in Savoie the way your elders made cheese in Savoie, the way their elders made cheese in Savoie, the way their elders made cheese in Savoie, etc. Because you don't mess with the tradition. If you're making cheese in Greensboro, Vermont, yes, that's a shout out to the people at Jasper Hill. Hi, Andy, and hi, Mateo. You do what you want.
Mm.
You take you blend northern and southern French traditions. you blend, you know, Dutch and Swiss traditions. You blend English and and what have you. You're really free to traipse across borders and do stuff. And the same holds true. A lot of the same holds true with beers.
Yeah. The and Are there certain geographic areas that have most of the cheese making
Oh, sure.
in the country?
And the ones you would pick off the top of your head are the ones that are doing it: Wisconsin, Vermont, California. I mean, there's some great cheese being made in North Carolina, great cheese being made in Indiana, and very great cheese being made in Oregon and Colorado. But by and large, those are the exceptions, whereas the previously mentioned states are, the big dogs.
Okay. And then how have you
Even if
when you
Vermont and California are pretty contrasting when it comes to size.
all right. And then when you got into craft beer, did you already know a lot, or is that something like you've kind of absorbed
Oh,
once
no,
you
no, no, no!
started looking in that
Cheesemongers love to
direction?
drink.
Okay, so that was okay.
It's rare to find a cheese. They exist, but it's
uh,
pretty unusual to find cheesemongers that don't drink. Um, and yeah, no, it was something I knew about. Something I knew about in general. I lived in the East Village from 1988 to 2019, and some of the very best early craft beer bars in New York City were in that neighborhood, and I had learned from a good friend in college what better beers were, and it was the sort of thing where it's like a lot of things. Once once you have a Duvel or a Schneider Weiss, you're not going back to drinking crap. It just doesn't work that way, and it doesn't have the same satisfaction as it might have once.
mhm.
And so I was drinking better beer in general, and um, and especially when I got to Bedford Cheese Shop in 2003 because 2004, because there was one of the city's great beer bars, Spite and Dival, right down the block. And we were two of the first major food endeavors in Williamsburg, so we got kind of a big dudes on campus discount there, and they had rare beers all the time. Um, so I learned a lot that way, and yeah. Um, so when I went to work at Gastronomy 491 in 2011, it was up my sleeve that I was thinking, okay, so where's the closest beer bar that I can either A, go to, or B, take my coworkers to for a brew? And then the owner asked me if I could build the beer program, and I was like, sure. And we did, and it was immensely well received. And so when the store itself was clearly failing, even better, not so much failing, but had such little interest in success. Um, I mean, both I worked two New Year's Eves, and I had to argue for sufficient staffing on each of them, and will always remember the owner saying, "Oh, New Yorkers don't mind waiting in line."
You're right.
And strong candidate for the dumbest thing an
Yeah.
employer has ever said to
Yeah.
me. But at any rate, so when I was looking to leave that place and finding nothing but frustration in cheese, yeah, I was able to transition over to craft beer pretty easily.
And I remember for me, like it's like local beer coming on the radar. I guess it was in the early aughts when I remember like Brooklyn Brewery, and I remember there was like Garrett Oliver all of a sudden kind of came on my radar. So it
Mm-hmm.
must have been like 2004, I think is what it was, and going there. And obviously, like since then, there's just been like a wild explosion of different like local beers here in New York and also just all over the country. When did you I guess, first kind of think like, wow, okay, this is like becoming a real thing? And do you ever look around now and say like it's jumped the shark?
I don't think it's Trump the shark. I don't think that it's a useful paradigm. Um, and I bristle at it a little bit because I've written for a lot of different places and start shooting the breeze about whatever it is I wrote about. And well, what else do you write about? And I was like, oh well, I've written some stories on craft beer. Oh, cool. Can you write one for us about it's over? Well, no, because it's not. Oh, but we want it to be. Who cares? It's not.
Right, right.
Um, in general, um, in general, craft beer is a fascinating thing when it comes to New York City because it the boom started in the late '70s, early '80s in where you would expect Northern California. Hello, Sierra Nevada. Hi, Anchor Steam. How y'all doing? And a whole slew of other California breweries came up to speed, and where you would also expect, yep, hello, Vermont. Um, and New York, as recently as 2014, was really not part of the picture. There was Brooklyn Brewery, and Brooklyn Brewery had made a conscious decision to make very good, solid, drinkable beers, and which was kind of what a lot of the breweries were doing, but they weren't really committed to going crazy. And the city was just so dramatically underserved, and you have the standard issue. I was talking about marketing executives wanting to get into something a little more real. Um, the survivors of the 2008 recession who still worked in finance definitely wanted, we're looking for ways out before the next 2008 came around. And that's why I think if you look at New York City itself has gone from 3 breweries in 2012 to more than 40 today. And if you look at so many of the backstories, there's a disenchanted former Golden person or disenchanted former Wall Streeter that's in the mix. And, the obstacle to New York City being involved in craft beer was that it's so darn expensive for land. Real estate is just. I did a story for the Wall Street Journal in 2014, kind of positing that itinerant brewing, wherein brewers go somewhere else, Western Massachusetts, for a day, brew their beer, come back, package their beer, and head to market with it, was a potential trend because the real estate values were so deep. I gave the specs on a brewery to the chief economist of the Brewers Association and got on the phone with him the next day and said, "Okay, how much seed money do you need to do that brewery in Atlanta?" He was like, "About 350,000. St. Louis, 275,000. Chicago, about 500,000. New York City, oh, 1,300,000, 1,400,000, maybe more." And it was, yeah, but a, a mid-level veteran Wall Streeter, you need to raise 1,400,000, 1,500,000 for a new venture. They can do that before lunch. The people who've survived a shakeout, they are good at what they do. And so suddenly you had this whole tier of people getting into the beer business that weren't daunted by the cost of New York City. And they started doing things that were really, really, really smart, like creating exclusive relationships with farms, in some cases buying farms, um, and you had a further impetus. The I think one of the lasting positive examples or initiatives from the Cuomo administration was the New York State Craft Act of 2014 that gave farmers a tax break for growing hops. It gave brewers a tax break for using New York hops. So it's just this creating this synergy to brew beer. And I don't think the act necessarily foresaw this, but this is just as the rise this is triggering the rise of the West Coast of the New England IPA, the hazy IPA, and which was popular because it was much more accessible than literally any other beer style had ever been before. And and you needed, it was making use of newer hops that were on the scene, like Motueka and Idaho 7. And so suddenly you've created this environment where farmers and brewers are incentivized to develop new hops that have, that have more fruit forward, more herbaceous flavors, more accessible flavors, and grow them and brew with them. And so it really triggered the explosion so that you have breweries like, breweries like KCBC in Brooklyn, where they have several rotating series of beers, where they will do it with Strata and Simcoe hops, one iteration, then Mosaic and Citra hops in the next iteration, and so on and so forth. And what winds up happening is, in much the same way that an enthusiastic wine drinker might know that a French Sauvignon Blanc is going to taste different than a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. You have beer drinkers that know that an IPA with Mosaic hops will taste differently than an IPA with Strata hops, and so you're educating your audience. And then the beer people were, I don't know if this was necessarily their game plan or it was just a result of wanting to do so many different types of beers. Part of the Craft Act legalized selling beer out of breweries, so that rather than brewing 5,000 cases of a beer once a month and saying it's our special, you could brew 500 cases of 10 types of beer every month and distribute them, three per week or whatever. And the limited supplies created a whole fear of missing out culture.
Okay. Yeah. So, what are some of your favorite like New York City, craft beer makers, and then maybe just like outside the city?
Um, in the city, I'm particularly fond of Grimm. I'm particularly fond of Other Half, like pretty much everybody else. I especially like Finback. Um, those are the obvious answers. Think if I can come up with a slightly, yeah. Here's a unique one. Back Home Brewing is one that I'm especially fond of. Um, amazing backstory. Very cool. I think it's just so emblematic of how the beer scene can be so open in a lot of different ways. It's an Iranian American woman who discovered that her grandfather, pre-revolution in Iran, used to brew in family home in Shiraz, and tracked down his recipes and started brewing them, and developed a huge groundswell of support from the Persian and Middle Eastern communities here, and beyond that, within the craft beer community, because her beer is really good, and so on and so forth. Um, Outside the city, there are in the nearby areas. There's tons of great brewing going on in Hudson Valley. Good friend of mine, famous jazz critic, used to live in Hudson Valley, and we would we we would forever argue. Hey man, we got to get together, have a few beers. Yeah, I want to come down to Brooklyn. I was like, no. I want to go up to Hudson Valley, and we wind up at an impasse, and we could never figure it out. Of course, now he lives in Philly, so I'm like, okay. And he doesn't get up to the city very much, so I'm like, fine, I'm coming to Philly. We'll drink there. But yeah, there's some very good breweries on Long Island. Oh, well, to call out a couple in Hudson Valley. Industrial Arts and Equilibrium are making phenomenal beer. To call out one in on Long Island, I would call out Abomination,
Okay.
but they also make wonderful beers. But yeah,
Okay.
there's great brewing going on everywhere. There are literally several thousand breweries have opened in the last 15 years across the U.S. And one of the this is totally Adam Smith, I think, would be proud. One of the things that makes this work is that you can't really traipse onto the scene these days making solid beer. No, you have to make, you have to throw for the end zone with every beer you make.
Well, and I talked to a friend in wine about this, and I asked him, like, how do you distinguish between like a trend and a transformation in the market? And he had, like, for him, he had said, what it was when I know we were talking about like orange wine, I think in particular,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, and maybe pet nats. But he was saying that, like, with orange, what he would say is that something is trendy when it becomes not interesting, when everything seems to kind of be the same.
Mm-hmm.
And what he found with, like, the exciting things were things where it's just like you continue to see evolution and like competition and like variety, um, which is actually an interesting thing for the idea of, like, the health of a society and, like,
Oh yeah.
civic dialogue. But that's why I wasn't definitely not advocating or looking for you to say that craft beer jumped the shark, but like I think as a somewhat skeptical consumer, you just kind of wonder when something, or if something has jumped the shark, or if there's still good things out there, because certainly there are plenty of like products and industries out there that just prey on, like, oh, people think this is cool, so they're just going to go
Oh yeah.
buy it. So
Oh yeah. 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 No, there are numerous hazy IPAs that utterly bore me, because it looks like it was just made to be something that's good with you know something that's good to be drunk with spicy food or whatever. But um, but the very best breweries are still pumping out really
okay,
interesting and new
okay,
stuff.
cool. All right. Well, we should probably wrap up, but before we say goodbye, I was wondering if you could tell me about maybe what gives you hope at the end of the day.
That's a tough one. Because over the years, you know, Ta-Nehisi Coates used to have a good answer for that. He would say, "That's not my job. I'm not. My job is not to give people hope." And then, of course, Obama was elected, and he thought, "Oh, no." you know, maybe. Of course, then he saw the aftermath and thought, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, I was right." But still, it's complicated. I like working in the food business. One of the things that I like doing is one of the things I get to do is work with young people. Now, granted, I'm 62, so the majority of the planet's younger than I am, but still, I get to work with young people, and more than ever, I think young people are aware of the ways in which American capitalism has failed, and yet they're still determined to have an interesting and well integrated life. And so that kind of inspires me because I'm not sure I would have remained steadfastly optimistic as they are had I encountered what I encountered. And of course, maybe I'm wrong because I graduated into the horrific recession of 1982 and wound up sending out about 50 cover letters for every, two or three job interviews that I actually got. But yeah, yeah, I would say, there's the notion either the people that have decided, okay, fine. I'm not going to be king of the world or queen of the world or whatever, but I'm going to have an interesting and fulfilling life. Or the people who said, fine. So the road to success doesn't involve climbing a mountain anymore. It involves climbing the side of a building without any equipment. Cool. I think I can get to this brick, then that brick, then that brick, then that brick, and away they go. So, yeah.
That's really, really interesting. Yeah, that. Thank you. That's Yeah, we could probably have another podcast just on that. but thank you for that. Um, and and Martin, thank you so much for joining me today. It's
Well,
been a
thanks
lot of
for
fun to have a
having me.
chance to catch up. So, all right, wish you all the best,
Thank you.
and I
You too.
and and thank you to our listeners, and may you all go out and enjoy exploring our American community.